Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Coffee and Comic Books. I am your host, Bodie Morningway from Quantum Comics and Collectibles, your friendly neighborhood comic book store where adventure awaits. So, as you can see, I've got my coffee and I've got my Stan Lee here. We are ready to talk some comic books. And if you may have noticed the stack that I have here, today I'm going to talk about G.I. Joe. Figured that might throw you guys in for a little bit of a twist, but G.I. Joe has been a fairly epic comic book, and it's not one that most people will think about when they think of comic books. But what's amazing about G.I. Joe is back in the 80s, which was pretty much the golden age for G.I. Joe, and when I was also a kid, G.I. Joe was the very first comic book to actually advertise on commercials. I remember these commercials with a very fond bit of nostalgia, and I still watch them today. You can actually catch them on YouTube, and I'd highly recommend you actually check them out because they're pretty fun. I mean, they've got the cheesy G.I. Joe type theme songs and everything, but the animation is actually really excellent and it gets you really pumped for that comic book, right? And the comics themselves, even though they were aimed at kids, they were really, really cleverly written. They were like the early Marvel comics. They were all like this too. Sure, they were aimed at kids as a target audience, but they have storylines that are very, very epic and complex in nature, much like what was represented in G.I. Joe. Initially, G.I. Joe was created, well, the comic book anyway, was created by Marvel Comics, and they gave all of the creative writing chores to a guy by the name of Larry Hama, who had been in the business for a short time, and he'd done a few things, including some art. But he took the reins of G.I. Joe, and he created these awesomely epic storylines. And this was a huge thing for that time period because the toys, of course, were really popular and massive. And this was a way to see how those characters actually interacted. Long before the cartoon ever came about. That came out much later. The comic preceded that by at least, I want to say 3 to 4 years. It may even have been more, might be less. I'm not 100% sure. But the comic work was absolutely epic, and it went on for over 100 issues, and a lot of it really, really good. They had certain issues that were, even in comic lore, really astounding. Like, for example, they had this one issue that was all a silent issue. A silent issue meaning there were no words. Everything was related through artwork. And I believe it was G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, number 21, where the character Snake Eyes infiltrates Destro's castle to rescue one of his teammates, Scarlet, from the clutches of all these various ninjas, and this other ninja that would eventually be known as Storm Shadow. But this also had a very intriguing mystery surrounding it, because at one point, both Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes had either their arm wraps cut or unraveled, or their sleeve. And underneath you saw this tattoo that both of them had. And before now, that had never been seen. So there was something that had these two characters relating to each other in a way that none of us fans at the time ever knew. Of course, eventually we found out that they were both in the Vietnam War together. They both, after the war, took part in Storm Shadow's family's ninja school, known as the Arashikage, I believe is what it's called. Anyways, and it goes on and on and on from there. But at this point, it was just so epic and amazing. And of course, Snake Eyes is one of those characters, kind of like Wolverine, where you don't know a heck of a lot about his origin, and when you do find stuff out, it seems to change, which is kind of a cool little thing. I actually prefer it when they do stuff like that rather than tell the whole origin, because you like to use your imagination, right? But anyway, G.I. Joe, excellent artwork, excellent storylines, right from the get-go. Really amazing stuff. You can see a few little pages of it there. And that's the original. But after about 100 issues, And if you think there's about 12 issues a year, so that went on for about over 10 years at Marvel Comics, which is pretty good, especially if it's not one of their core titles, right? It's not like a Spider-Man or an Avengers or a Fantastic Four or X-Men. Those can go on forever. This was G.I. Joe, right? This was made from a toy line. Nobody expected it to do this well, but it did because people loved it, and they loved it because it was so well written. And that's thanks to Larry Hama, who had a lot of stipulations on his work. For example, whenever there was a new toy, he had to find a way to stick that into the storyline somehow. And not all these toys made a heck of a lot of sense, especially not in the real world. Sure, I mean, you'd have some great little torpedo boat that could zap water or something, but it didn't always make sense in the context of the comic book. This is Storm Shadow, by the way, for those of you that are not familiar. But eventually, G.I. Joe's run at Marvel would end, and then they would move to different companies, such as Devil's Due and Image Comics, and they had other titles like Disavowed and America's Elite. And then Image Comics would make their own series of G.I. Joe comics. And then finally, they brought back Larry Hama after, how many years? Probably, I want to say 10 to 20 years, somewhere in there, a time frame. And they asked him to continue writing G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero, in a new series, but from the very last comic that he did of Marvel Comics. So whereas the other comic book companies that took over G.I. Joe for that time frame decided to recreate the whole concept, recreate the origins of the characters, recreate their looks of the characters, what IDW did at this point was they asked him to go back to the original Marvel stories and just continue them. See, when they got the patent or the whatever it's called, the rights, that's it, the rights to G.I. Joe, they got the ability to reprint some of the old Marvel stuff. And that's actually the very first volume that I showed you was an IDW reprint of old Marvel comic stuff. So Larry Hama took these old stories and old characters, and he continued all of his stories. But this time he didn't have to worry about, let's say, the censors, the comic book censors, because they were pretty big at that time. It couldn't be too terribly violent, or they'd, slap a warning on you and say, redo it. Comics had changed in that time, so now he could make the comics like he wanted them. And we have G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero, from IDW. And it has continued those old stories with those original characters, those original concepts, to the modern day, and it is still going, and it is an excellent, excellent story. You can see some of the art there by S.L. Gallant. He's a really exceptional artist. He does an excellent job. And Larry Hama is still going to this day with G.I. Joe, a Real American Hero. Oddly enough, this is not something that anyone really expected. As I mentioned, it was just a toy line comic book. I think initially Marvel was probably thinking they'd do a dozen or so issues tops. And it just boomed. It exploded into something absolutely amazing. And I've met Larry Hama. He is an exceptionally awesome individual. I got to actually even introduce him to my family, which was great. Always wonderful. I don't think my kids or anybody actually quite understood the momentous event of meeting this guy, at least how it was for me, but I hope they have some inkling of how important that was. Anyways, that's it for another episode of Coffee and Comic Books. Keep in mind, we are still, although not open to the business, we are, did I say not open to the public is what I meant. We are still open for business on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. We have this wonderful new thing called our Cosmic Crate of denominations of $50 and $100. You tell us what you want, some interesting things, some ideas, some concepts, some characters, and we will put together a fantastic little crate for you. In fact, I got to get back to doing some more. All right? See you, Space Cowboys.